the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame, established 2020. In Guyra, Kevin Gilbert and Banjo Patterson are among a few of the poets that we celebrate here at the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame in Guyra. But I'm speaking to you now because I'd like to ask for your help to preserve our great literature and poets of Australia. In front of us, we've got the Australian Poetry Library and Archive. And in a little over, 15 months, I've managed to accumulate over 150 Australian poetry books. And I'd like to explain why that's important to you. Actually, it's more like 180 Australian poetry books, but that's all right. Well, you see, I was reading an article in The Guardian the other day about how a lot of our great literature is now out of print. Well, this goes especially, and is especially true for poetry and poets. You see, there's many great poets here in Australia that many people have not heard of. You've all heard of probably Banjo Patterson, Henry Lawson, and the great Oodgeroo Noonuccal Kath Walker. But how many of you have heard of Ernest Briggs or Dimitris Saloumas or Varel Innes? And that's what I'm here to ask you for today, is to help out by sending us old copies of out-of-print books that might be sitting on your shelf that you've read or are not ever going to read, but could come here to the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame, where they'll be preserved in a poetry library and archive for all Australians. So take this one for example. Dimitris Saloumas was a Greek-Australian poet, born in 1921, moved to Australia in 1952 or 3 or something like that. And won many awards for his poetry, which was often printed, some of them were printed in Greek and in English. This one here, Ernest Briggs, published in 1952 by the Courier Mail in Brisbane. So this book here is, 69 years old. And it's out of print. It hasn't been printed. And if these things are just sitting on people's shelves, often they move, they get put in boxes, they get put in sheds, they get wet, they get mouldy, and they get chucked out. Well, that's what the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame here aims to prevent and preserve important poetry of Australian writers here in the archive and library that you saw out there earlier. Another example of the preservation of Australian poetry are these small self-published poetry books that many poets publish. This one here by Varel Innes. Now, I'm not too sure exactly what her name was. Her real name was Jean something. But this was, she lived up into her 90s, and she's well and truly passed on now. But we know that little books like this that were never published by proper big publishing companies, there might have only ever been 100 copies of them ever printed. And if they are lost or thrown out, well, then they're lost for all time. And that's why my job here to preserve these Australian poets in an archive is really important. So I'm asking you to send me your poetry books of our great and forgotten Australian poets to the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame here at 144 Bradley Street, Guyra, and you can be assured that they will go into our poetry library and archive out there and be preserved for future generations to learn from, to enjoy, and so the words of these great poets linger on and are not forgotten. I'd like to read you something now by Ernest Briggs, The Timeless Flowers and The Water Carrier. Just a few things. This one's just a beautiful, short, 4-line poem, The Timeless Flowers. The jade-encrusted palanquins have gone to halls of turquoise and the tapering towers. Beneath the pine the poet muses on the timeless flowers. So, that address again. If you've got poetry books, even if they're newly printed by you, you can send me one. Or if you've got poetry books on your shelf, it's the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame, 144 Bradley Street Guyra. Get those books off your shelf, put them in the mail tomorrow and send them to me here so that our great poets are not forgotten and lost for all eternity. And in advance, I'd like to thank you very much. I'm Thundercloud at the Australian Poetry Hall of Fame in Seahorse Medicine Room, and I'll see you later. And big thanks to all our wonderful Australian poets, and big thanks to you for sending me your poetry books too. Lots of love.